Welcome back to another episode of the Open Source Cafe. Joe, welcome back to the channel. Very nice to have you back. Always a pleasure. And for those of you who don't know about Joe, Joe, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm a developer educator at Twilio, where I work on Twilio Quest, Twilio's free educational game that helps you learn to code and learn various code-related concepts. I've been doing developer relations and educational stuff for coming on to 7 years now, which is ridiculous to say. And yeah, thank you so much for having me back. It's a delight to be here.
Awesome. And if you all want to check out Twilio Quest, you can basically learn about open source, which you ask me quite a lot. So we are running a contest right now. And even after the contest, you can take part and you can check out the links in the description. I've made an entire tutorial on it. So over 400 folks have already joined in. We have some amazing prizes. So make sure you check it out and have some fun while learning. So today we're talking about education, right? Everything related to how education has changed and what we are doing in the education field, and we'll also talk about how to be a good teacher and a leader, and all about like communities and stuff, and how new initiatives like Tulio Quest are coming up to revolutionize, let's
Right.
say, education, for example. So Joe, you mentioned that you have been in the DevRel space for the past 7 years. It means
Yeah,
that you have been you have been a student way before that as well, so that's
sure.
over a decade years of experience, if I'm not
Yeah.
wrong. so
Yes,
so
you
how,
include the
how
student bit. Yeah.
yeah. So how do you think that education has changed like over the
Right.
years, and where do you think we are headed?
Sure, yeah. In particular, most of my experience being with technical education, and I think the big shift there has been in, accessibility, both in terms of I'm a learner and I want to get some content about a topic, but also I know something and I want to distribute some content about a topic, right? In the last 7 years, we've seen the rise of MOOCs, things like edX and Coursera, and now kind of like the consumerization of that with Udemy. There's lots of big educational coding YouTube channels. I guess like the big thing here I'm getting at is like, being like a technical influencer has become a thing. And that means that there's lots of people out there who can produce free educational material for technical audiences and be sustained, in ways other than charging the audience, right? So there's a lot more free content out there of a lot higher quality than there's been for a long time. Sorry, I thought I heard you on mute if you wanted to jump in with something.
No, that's fine.
No
So
problem.
basically, it's much more accessible now. Is that what you're
Right.
saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot more content that's free. You know, I think the other big change is the industry has reacted to this. We saw it with boot camps where, there was an initial, oh, hey, we don't have to go to university degrees to get talent anymore. There's now boot camps. And now that's kind of happening again, where, we're having that further conversation of like, hey, do we even need to look at formal education at all? How do we test the value of people's self-learning? And I know that's something that you're very passionate about in the education system that a lot of your viewers come from, and the kind of legacy system there that you're trying to provide alternatives to. So I think you probably see a lot more of that side of it than I do.
I totally agree with that. And speaking from like the education point of view, how do you
Yeah.
think that the hiring has changed for, let's say, we are
Right.
talking about technical roles,
Yeah.
right? And what are your views on like you know when companies hire, like
Right.
big tech companies, mostly
Yeah.
whiteboarding interviews, startups
Right.
mostly based on like your work experience or whatever.
Sure.
So how do you think that has changed over the years, the hiring part?
Yeah. I think I think it's gotten better. And by that I mean I think there has been a shift to supporting more routes into the industry. When I left my degree, a computer science degree was like, heavily compulsory. You probably needed a master's. There are certain companies and certain routes where you do still need that degree, certain economies where that degree is more emphasized. But the simple matter is, like, in a lot of economies now, there are more roles than can be filled by the traditional educational system. People want more breadth of experience. They want people who, have operated in companies for a while, or have humanities degrees, and so they're more in support boot camps. But then also just like the way we interview is shifting a lot. There's a lot more companies now who won't ask you about your degree or your qualifications when you apply. They're just interested in how you do with their process, and we're starting to see a lot of processes now, a lot of hiring processes that emphasize skills that will be used on the job rather than say
Hmm.
DSA, right? Like rather than like, hey, can you reverse a binary tree on a whiteboard? Because you know the average web developer is never going to do a lot of those things, and there are roles where those things are important, and that's why they exist in computer science. But I think a lot of people are realizing that when they are hiring, there are better ways to do it than those techniques, and so that opens the doors to people who don't necessarily just come from university, right?
Yeah, and when we're talking about education, open source has been around for a while
Right.
now.
Yeah.
But when we talk about education in the field of open source, that has
Yeah.
gone to be quite popular now. You might
Sure.
have heard about like there's Google Summer of Code, and now there's
Right.
MLH fellowship programs, right?
Yeah.
So people and organizations are utilizing open source
Hmm.
as a mode of education, for
Yeah.
example. So what are your thoughts about that, and where
Yeah.
are we headed with it?
Yeah, so I see this as the examples that you mentioned, Google Summer of Code and MLH Fellowship, are a really good example of like looking at open source as an alternative to the internship or as a more accessible version of work experience. Internships, this idea of having a job over a year or summer at your school or whatever, have always been there's always been a not enough of them for all of the people that need them because they kind of became compulsory, and so every student needed one, but not every student can get an internship, right? But open source, has kind of this other set of problems where if you're an open source maintainer, you're probably working for no money, and onboarding a new maintainer to your project is really hard. Like getting someone up to the point where you are confident that they can, commit to that project without your oversight, that's a lot of work. And so the fellowship and Google Summer of Code do this really interesting thing where larger companies are providing funding for people to work on a project, get onboarded, work on it for a reasonable length of time, make a good contribution in such a way that like it addresses some of the long-standing issues of open source maintenance and funding, but also provides more of these internship type experiences for more students. So I think that's super cool. I think they're really important. I think open source in general is going through a difficult period right now with corporate involvement and how open source projects reckon with that and how the open source community reckons with that, especially around like, hey, a big company is using my software, but I get nothing back for it as a maintainer. And I think this whole, this way of funding those projects via funding talent for them is a potential, way to improve that situation. So I think it's really exciting, and obviously super exciting if you are trying to get an interesting project to work on over the summer. You can get funded to do it. I applied for Google Summer of Code when I was in uni, did not get in, but it was even just the brief experience I had with interacting with the project mentors and working out what project I could work on. Even that was like super valuable. So I really, yeah, just think they're great programs, and they're a fantastic way to get that experience you need on your CV.
Yeah, most definitely, and it helped me quite a lot as well when I was not
Yeah.
getting internships. Like open
Right.
source came to the rescue. So
Yeah.
if you are interested in contributing to open source, I've actually made a video on it, like Google Summer of Code and
Yeah.
open source programs you can apply to and how to get started and everything. You can check it out on my channel and make sure you like, share, and subscribe. All right, and also like when you get involved in these projects, it's also like the maintainers and the project community is also benefiting because they want to
Yeah.
get the young folks getting the young folks involved in their community
Yeah.
because they are the ones who are going to be leading the project after a while. But speaking of like, let's talk about what we were mentioning earlier. So
Yeah.
you mentioned like Udemy, you mentioned Coursera, you
Right.
mentioned all these boot camps,
Right.
and then you mentioned like I personally know folks as well who watch these boot camps and take part
Right.
in it and do these online courses, and then they get a job or whatever.
Right.
But another question is, what do we talk about when we talk about the role of a teacher, right?
Yeah.
So now we don't have that online.
Right.
So how
Yeah.
is that? Is like how does that work? Like,
Yeah.
what are the roles of a teacher when we talk about
Sure.
this industry, and
Yeah.
what are like some of the pros and cons?
Yeah. Honestly, and this is, I think this has always been the case in every teaching thing, but I think the current online teaching situation with tech has really proved this. And I think the role of a teacher is curation, right? So when you're like, say the traditional case, you're listening to a lecturer in a lecture theatre in a university, like, they're drawing on their experience to teach you, but their experience is made up of like, all these things they've learned, it's all these papers, it's all these books, and they're picking the best bits to teach you, right? And when we talk about, these teachers, like people who are producing YouTube videos or people who are running these courses, and you think about the challenges of being a learner in tech right now, like if you want to learn to program right now and you go to Google and say like learn to code, where do you even start, right? Like it's there's too much, there's too many different concepts. And so honestly, I think like the role of a teacher in our industry right now in this format, in this virtual world, is more about having the context of like, hey, where are my students at? Where do they want to be? And what are the sets of things I can help them focus on to get there? How do I pare down the distractions? How do I pick the good materials from, there's a lot of material, not all of it's worth watching or listen or reading. And so I think that's a really valuable role of the teacher in the current situation. And, I definitely, in the past, when people have, when I've spoken to people about getting started with programming, one of the things I always caution them on is like jumping from tutorial to tutorial, because there's so many tutorials out there, so much content out there. And lots of people and I've been stuck in this, lots of people get caught in the cycle of like, starting a tutorial, doing the intro, and then seeing a better tutorial and jumping over to that one. And you just do the intros of like 20 different courses and you never finish any of them. And so I think that's a problem that's partly solved by, by people like you, by these online teachers, by people like Eddie. And I think that's increasingly going to be the case where, teachers are curators. They are bodies of knowledge. They know which knowledge is worth listening to. They're able to get you the right knowledge at the right time. One of the things that I was new when I encountered your community was this idea of like having a roadmap for a topic. And I think that's like, that's your community identifying this problem and paring it down to like the most concise ask. It's like, hey, we need a roadmap through these concepts. And I think it's the role of the teacher increasingly to provide that roadmap.
Yeah, because there's plenty of content out there for literally anything you want to learn.
Right.
So why is it that people are struggling with learning? Yeah. Well, it's not like well defined. The content is available there, but just folks just need it to be in a more well defined manner.
Yeah.
So all right. Sure. So now we're talking about schools and so teachers, like, okay, we replace that with like online content creators or whatever. That's fine. What about then what about schools? Like, just are schools like really necessary in 2022? like when you hear about we hear about folks like, I want to be a billionaire, like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, they all dropped out, and why would I want to do? First of all, I would not recommend dropping out. Like, they definitely think like those are very small percentage of people. Not everyone is going to become a billionaire after dropping out. 100%. And they had an idea in mind. But what do you think? Like when we talk about the skill set, so what are the skills you learn in school, and what are the skills that you learn outside school?
So this is a spicy topic, and bear in mind my opinion on this is just my opinion. So like from the time I was in uni, this conversation about like, all the rich people are dropouts was happening. My perspective on this is that schools are really valuable places, but not necessarily for the skills you pick up towards your degree subject. Like, I think, and again, my perspective here, primarily British university, is going to vary around the world, but my perspective on like, my schooling was like, I wouldn't be who I am today without going for that university system. Yeah, I might be able to get the technical knowledge somewhere, but there's a huge value in like, being of a certain age and going out into the world and meeting people who have similar interests to you and who are all going through that life experience. And I just think it's a life stage that, gives you a level of independence and a level of like ability to, pursue your objectives that otherwise is very hard to get. And so I think like, there's a lot of life skills that school gives you. And I think this is a freeing thing, right? Like I would focus, if we're talking about tech, we're talking about you want to get a career in tech, and we decide that, what we're talking about here is true, that you don't necessarily need to get a CS degree to have a career in tech. There's lots of other ways to learn. I would look at school instead as a school of life and say, hey, what else might be useful for me to learn in my life, or I was going to do a different degree? What am I personally passionate about? I can get the rest on the side and just enjoy that time and that experience, right? And that's obviously going to be, if you try and explain that to your parents and they're like, no, you're going to be a doctor, and that's going to be a difficult. No, but I want to do art. That's going to be a difficult conversation to have. But I think the more we get to separating what we do as a vocation from how we learn and grow as a person, I think everything will be better for it. I want more CS people with humanities degrees. And, I think the fact that with this link between the skills you learn in uni and the job you have is kind of breaking is actually a good thing for the world. Because I think it will mean that, university shouldn't just be like technical pipelines. They should be, institutions of learning and furthering humanity. And so I think it's good that link breaks down.
Yeah. In many fields, even in computer science, a degree is required when we talk about you want to do research work, for example.
Sure.
So a degree in that case is a really good way to go. And I totally agree. School is a time where you explore yourself, and it's not just about the study part, but also the life experiences. Yeah, but definitely
the other thing, you mentioned research work there. That is another thing that's worth mentioning. Obviously, again, I gave my perspective as a white British person. Another area where having a degree in your profession is really important is immigrating, moving country. Like if you want to move country, you likely will need a degree in your field to get a visa. So that's an important thing to think about, is where do you want to be in 5 years time? Because that's another huge factor. Is it will just make all of your immigration processes easier if you have that degree.
Yeah, and speaking from my experience with college, I think there are good colleges and there are some colleges that are not so good. But I think when we talk about the curriculum, definitely explore outside the college as well.
Yeah.
Get involved in communities and open source and learn new skills and try to find your passion, so on and so forth.
The other thing, last thing I'll say on this, sorry, I know you want to move on. The other thing, there is definitely, there is some magic to to learning from experts in your field in person. And the personal anecdote I'll give to this is before I went to uni, I was trying to learn to code independently for ages. And, this is partly a curation problem, but I'd been dabbling with code, but I never felt confident. I never felt like I knew what I was doing. And then in university within the first year, so many things clicked that it wasn't any different than my self-study. It wasn't like I was shown some magical new programming language or something. It was all the same stuff I was already reading, but just the learning environment helped me absorb some concepts. So there is definitely, I said, the being in a community of people all trying to learn is the valuable part. And that could be school, that could be an online community, like a hackathon, whatever. But that is definitely something offered. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of that, who has taught you a lot in your life when you talk about talk about the person, the experts you get to learn with? So if you could pick someone.
Yeah. I would probably say my manager at GitHub, who's now no longer at GitHub, but Mozzarella, Vanessa. The reason I would pick Vanessa is because it was via her that I became aware of a lot of the topics and experiences that I now draw on in my career. I'd been a developer advocate for a number of years. I did workshops. I taught people without really any conception of what that meant. And Vanessa introduced me to, all of the academia behind learning design. And Vanessa has a postgrad in education from Harvard, and so I got exposed to a lot of her thoughts and feelings around that world, and then a load of other just things in general. But that is definitely an area that has a huge influence on my work today and the way I think about these things today. That pretty much all came from working under Vanessa.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for sharing, and thanks for the shout out as well. All right, and when we talk about learning, everyone has a different style of learning, right? Some like to learn from videos, some like reading documentation.
Yeah.
What about you? How do you like to learn?
I am a big text person. I prefer paper books. When I'm not on paper books, I prefer written tutorials. And the reason for that is I really like to skim, especially, and I think this is something that's more true with, a number of years experience behind me. Like if I start reading a programming tutorial now, there are going to be parts of that which like I don't need to relearn or that already makes sense to me. And so I want to skip to the bits I don't. And it's much easier to do that in a text document than like scrubbing for a video. Obviously, I really like gamified. Well, I wouldn't say I like gamified learning. I like games as an entertaining medium that can teach me things. So I work on a lot of educational games and also play a lot of educational games. I'm a big fan of like Zachtronics, of Learning Factory, of like these programming games. These games that make programming part of the gameplay. But yeah, primarily I'm a text-based person. That's just because I can control F, I can save snippets,
Yeah.
and also I like project-based learning as well. Like I will often dive into if I can clone a repo and break some things that I enjoy a lot. Yeah,
I agree, and I love your point about like it's much faster when we
right.
talk about like videos. So that I'm a big text person as well, and yeah, learn by doing.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for bringing up that
Yeah.
point. Also, extremely, extremely
And
important.
I do think that's the experience point. Like if I'm learning a brand new topic from scratch, I am much more excited to watch a video. So I've been doing some game engine stuff recently that I don't know really anything about. And like watching a video on that, that's perfect. I know nothing.
Yeah,
Walk me through it step by step. But once I've got a bit of experience in the subject, text is faster. But I do think if you're
yeah.
starting out, there's nothing wrong with videos at all.
Cool, cool,
Yeah.
cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot for sharing. And
Yeah.
speaking of gaming,
Yeah.
I've seen like there's Twilio Quest and then there's Battlesnake. So, two questions:
Hmm.
what and why?
So people like games, right? Like we like fun. Games are fun. They do things to our
Yeah.
brains that we like. Um, I think there's a lot of opportunities there to hijack that process and add some education to it. And in some ways, I think Twilio Quest isn't yet a perfect example of this because in a lot of Twilio Quest missions, it plays more like a normal online course that happens to be in a game.
Hmm.
But we're getting there with like we have a narrative that's interesting. We have some places where the game, like there's a part in the JavaScript mission where it's about looping and you
Hmm.
have to like loop around the mission to make stuff work. But like there are games where the mechanics are rooted in what you learn, and so you're learning by playing, but you don't necessarily feel like you're doing anything else other than playing, and that I think
Hmm.
is really powerful and is really special. So a game I've been playing recently is called The Signal State, which is about analog modular synthesizers. So it's about like computers that work on audio signals and plugging cables into different places, and you solve puzzles by building synthesizers. And so you're getting through these puzzles, and I'm learning about modular synthesizers, but to me, I'm
Hmm.
engaging with a puzzle, and that's really, really cool. So you also mentioned Battlesnake. Battlesnake is a project that I have sponsored in the past and then been a player and now an advisor. And Battlesnake is kind of the extreme of this, where like the way you play it is writing code. It's a
Hmm.
competitive AI game where you write the AI to control a snake that then combats other snakes. And that to me is a really interesting game because like you can't play it without writing code. It's using the
Hmm.
skills we have, but in an entertaining in ways we don't use them in our day job. And like I think there's something very fulfilling about having a set of skills that you use to earn money during the day and then being able to find entertainment in them, and also being able to learn. Like I've learned a lot more about you know all kinds of things that I haven't touched during university. Weird algorithms. Monte Carlo tree search is very popular in Battlesnake right now, for
Hmm.
example. It's like, and I think I've said this to you before in the last open source cafe, maybe. Like Battlesnake is like one of the places that makes data structures and algorithms really fun. Like
Yeah.
there's in a way that like you don't encounter anywhere else. Like if you want to practice your A-star tree
Practice.
search, yeah,
Yeah.
A-star tree search. That's all right. If you want to practice your A-star
Yeah.
pathfinding, or you want to practice your binary tree searching, building a battle snake is a great place to do it. And
Yeah.
that's awesome. I think that's super great. So I think gaming and education has a long way to go. There's some really bad examples of it. Like when we talk about gaming and education, I'm not talking about like streaks or hey, you'll earn a reward for doing XYZ things. Like I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking about you know, good gameplay that the mechanics are based in skills that are useful. And yeah, there's a lot of these out there now. There's a Steam category for programming games, which is actually looking really full nowadays, that I'd highly recommend. We're probably going to be doing some of this on a Twilio Quest stream soon. Myself and Ryan, the other one of the Twilio Quest developers, we're probably just going to start playing programming games on stream and like analyzing them from an education perspective. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested in this.
Cool. I'll leave all the links in the description. But one more question I have for you is, so this is a very unique field, right? When we talk about gaming plus education and plus lots of potential. I only found out about this like when I was introduced to Battlesnake. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. So you have been working on it. Have you ever had like a discussion about how this can help or what other challenges it can solve? For example, like ADHD, right?
Sure.
Or some other people who may not be too good at the conventional learning process and how they can learn programming via gaming, or because when we talk about children's, so there's like so many mobile apps that are like really high in graphics and gaming, and you just there are a lot of games for you to
just
learn alphabets
swiping
or whatever.
and press buttons.
So thinking from the psychological like point of view, do you think like it can definitely like if someone is working towards solving such issues like ADHD and making it more diverse in terms of the learning experience, for example, for a lot of folks?
Yeah, I can't say a whole lot about the ADHD side. That's definitely not an area I have a lot of experience in, but I think diversifying the ways we can learn is a huge one, and particularly for kids. Like gameplay driven learning experiences are really powerful there. Like Minecraft education is a really good example of this. And that's definitely an area that we hope to support more with Twilio Quest. I think it also brings up a load of interesting challenges, right? Like some of the things that makes games really fun, like the freedom to explore, just the gameplay itself makes lives really difficult for teachers. Like if you're a teacher and you want to know exactly, what all your students like, which assignment of all of my students completed, like a game is actively hostile to that. So I think there's some things to solve here. But on your point about kids, one of the things we're really interested in at Twilio Quest and why it's a desktop game, in fact, is like you mentioned, like tablet and mobile games and that whole computing paradigm. One of the things we're trying to do with Twilio Quest is actually just teach people how their computers work, because that's kind of lost a little bit now in computers in general. Like a big one's filed. There was this big conversation happening a couple of months ago where because of tablets and because of mobile phones, you don't really have files on those things, right? Everything just lives in the cloud. And actually now, like today's students going into school now have never encountered like a file in a directory, and so they don't actually know how file systems work, or that they exist, or that computers use them. And that's a wild thing to think about. And so to me, there's this like old thing that was spoken about with cars, where like when cars were first invented, everyone had to know how the car worked and how to fix their own car. And then over the years, as they became more widespread and more consumerized, not only does no one know how to fix their cars now, but actually you can't fix them yourselves because they're so locked down by the manufacturer. And I think the same thing is happening in computing, and that's something that we are really interested in tackling as a game, is like teaching people, not just how to write code, but how that, how does that code fit into their model of their computer, and how does that computer run, and how do they maintain that system? And so that's that's the one area of when we think about young people learning to code that we think about quite a lot.
Yeah, and now speaking of abstraction, another thing comes to my mind is no-code platforms. Right. So people are saying they are no-code platforms are the future, and it's gonna like replace whatever it's gonna replace or whatever. Right. I personally think these are my views because I have used a lot of those. I think like it's not going to replace developers, first of all, because the amount of complex systems that you can build without non-code platforms. Like non-code platforms are good for like building some simple applications or whatever. Maybe some more complex applications, but you can't compare it with like pure hardcore development. So definitely one thing I would like to recommend is it's a great thing because it's opening up opportunities to non-coders to build their businesses or platforms or whatever. But about the future, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree. I think no code. There's this great XKCD comic which answers this. The one about like, hey, what do you call a like to write a program? You need to write a sufficiently advanced specification. What do you call a sufficiently advanced specification? Code. But yeah, I agree that no code platforms are great for if you have a system where there is a powerful set of abstractions that you can represent in the minimal
Mhm.
way. That's where no code comes in. So no code is great for like API glue, right? If you know there's a service that outputs this and there's a service that consumes that, linking them together in no code makes sense. But as you said, the minute you get into a new domain or an abstract domain, no code platforms, kind of you end up reaching the end of one node code platform and needing to build a new one. I think where they are really useful in an education perspective is they're really useful with new coders who have not yet encountered like the idea of programming, like the if this then that, right? Like the logical part of it, and they're really useful. I'm a big fan of Scratch or Blockly, and actually I built a Blockly editor for Battlesnake recently, and that's a really fantastic example of this, where like if you are new, if you've never seen code before, block based visual languages are really cool to be able to say like, hey, if this then that, that's coding. Now I just need to learn the individual syntax of a language, right? But if you try and do anything real, if you try to write a real Battlesnake with my no code Battlesnake tool, it turns monstrous really quickly, and you want to go back to a programming language because it's absolutely not doable. So I think they have their place. I think they are definitely a useful set of tools, but they are kind of confined to well understood, well specified domains. And the minute you get outside those boxes, you need code, essentially.
Totally agree with that. All right. Thanks a lot for sharing, Joe.
No
And one
worries.
more question I have is, how has COVID-19 affected the learning process?
It's ruined it. So I think, what do I think? So
What is the silver lining and what are the cons?
yeah, I mean, the silver lining is a lot of institutions are having to support remote learners in ways that they didn't bother with before. And that is, in general, a good thing for accessibility. When they are having to make videos available and having to caption those videos and they're having to, this is good for everyone. Even if we return to the way things were, having this set of skills be tested and these things put in place, it's better for students, with sensory difficulties. It's better for students who, have other reasons they can't get into a university, or into a school. It isn't just in general a really good thing. I think where it's difficult is, the thing we're all talking about with work right now is like, if you are learning right now, you are not going through the normal student experience. You are learning in a context where, like, we're in the third calendar year of a pandemic that's claiming millions of lives, and that's generally a thing hanging over all of us. And we're all trying to carry on as if everything is normal. But, like, that's gonna be doing something to us. And at the same time, you're trying to learn, you're trying to get a career. That's a lot to deal with as a young person, quite frankly. And so I think, that is the thing. Just be kind to yourselves right now if you are learning. Recognize that, like, you are experiencing a set of situations that is like unprecedented in human history, and everyone just wants you to carry on as if that's normal. But it's not normal, and it's okay to feel like that's not normal.
I agree with that. And when we talk about learning, like overall, this last question is, what advice would you have for, the learners, and what
Yeah,
advice would you have for the educators?
sure. Yeah, I think for learners, again, the big thing I'd say there is like be conscious of the other factors that are happening. Like be kind to yourself is a really easy thing to say, but just like if you are feeling like you're learning something too slow or you're feeling burnt out, you know, in the it's very easy to internalize that and think, oh, that's me, and not realize that, you know, it's the world and everyone feels that way and you're fine, your life is going to be fine. Like, everyone else is in this situation as well and is also not feeling good, and you yourself will not be behind. And then, yeah, the flip side of that for educators, like, get good at teaching remotely, get good at providing these other materials, and don't drop those skills. That, like, we need to get out of this pattern of like, oh, COVID's looking better next month, I'll go back to in person. Oh, surprise, COVID wasn't better, I can't go back to in person. Just get good and we're third calendar year in this, right? We should have like not only cracked video teaching, but started innovating on it, right? And we're not, because people are so determined that just over the hill we'll go back to the way things were. We are not going back to the way things are. Let's start making something better. That is what we should now be doing, right? But instead, everyone just wants to go back rather than accepting that and moving forward. So that's my advice for educators.
Yeah, I mean, we all want it deep down. I,
Yeah.
I think like with virtual events, no matter how hard I try now, it's just not that good. It's
Yeah.
no matter how people have tried so many things with,
Yeah.
like, like CubeCons and stuff. So
Right.
first virtual CubeCon was great.
Yeah.
Second was nice. Now
Yeah.
after a while, it's just getting like a lot
Yeah.
repetitive.
But I mean, and this isn't what this is about, so I won't spend too long on this. But the reason why I think like this doesn't work is because what everyone is trying to do with virtual events is just replicate what worked about physical events, rather than like rather
Innovating.
than taking unique
Yeah,
advantage of what virtual offers us. Roguelike conference is the only conference I think that has done this well. But yeah,
That's it. That's it. Alrighty. Well, thanks a lot for joining, Joe, and for everyone else.
thank you for
I'll
having me.
leave all the links in the description, everything we shared, along with some amazing resources. And we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.